On behalf of the Clements Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft, Department of History, the Classics Department, welcome to this lecture by Dr. Eric Cline. Part of the Clements Center's mission involves bringing the insights of diplomatic, military, and intellectual history to contemporary statecraft. To that end, we're hosting our annual Strategic Insights from the Ancient World lecture. In previous years, the lecture has hosted historians, classicists, and political theorists that discuss how ancient military, political, and intellectual history provide insights to contemporary events and politics. With this in mind, we could not ask for a more perfect scholar than Dr. Eric Cline. He's a historian, scholar of the ancient Near East, classicist, and active field archaeologist with over 30 seasons of excavations. He is currently a professor of classics and anthropology and director of the George Washington University Capitol Archaeological Institute. His list of awards is vast and varied. For example, he is a National Geographic Explorer. He is under consideration for the Pulitzer Prize for 1177 BC, and he is a Fulbright scholar. His list of books is equally impressive. He has reshaped the fields of biblical studies, biblical archaeology, and energized enthusiasts of ancient Near Eastern military history. For example, his book, The Battles of Armageddon, which is how I came to know Dr. Cline before I actually got the honor of meeting him in person, explores the military history of Megiddo, including an intriguing and clever take on the famous battle that is supposed to occur there in the future, Armageddon. More recently, his book, 1177 BC, describes a world beset by military conflicts, climate change, and the widespread collapse of political entities. Sounds familiar, but he's talking about 1177 BC and the end of the Bronze Age. Incidentally, we just discovered today, we just got an email, that it has made the French National Bestseller List. It's already translated in 4 languages in addition to English, and there's supposed to be another 5, which is 9, 10 languages total. It's impressive indeed. With books such as these, Dr. Cline has taken a balanced approach to scholarship, and at the same time that he makes his topics accessible to a wider audience and relevant for the modern world. Drawing on this rich background and expertise, he will now discuss 3,000 years of history in about an hour. This topic is the exciting and ongoing series of conflicts centered around that most famous of cities, Jerusalem. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arafat.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. You can all hear me in the back, even those who are standing. Okay, sorry about that, but I hope it's worth the stand. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. It's I think my 3rd trip to Austin, 91 and 2005 and now. So nice to be back. And thank you all for coming. I hope this will be useful, enjoyable, and that you'll take something away from it. My goal was to make what happened in antiquity and the Middle Ages relevant to today. So this, Jerusalem Besieged, 4,000 Years of Conflict in the City of Peace, kind of also has a subtitle of The Use and Abuse of Ancient History. And you'll see what I mean as we go along. But in order to start with it being completely relevant, let me start with 2 weeks ago, when Netanyahu was in the last stages of being almost not elected, but re-elected in Israel. And he said that no to statehood for Palestinians. That was one of his last stump speeches. And then as soon as he got elected, he kind of walked back from that as well. But that created all kinds of furor in the U.S. press. And in fact, there was an article just this past week on whether the U.S. should recognize the state of Palestine. I'm not going to go into that. That's not the topic of the lecture today. But I wanted to bring to your attention what it said here, that a 2-state solution for Israel and Palestine has been an American policy for nearly 2 decades. In the 2002 speech, George W. Bush became the first president to explicitly call for the creation of an economically sustainable, demilitarized Palestinian state. And he said in 2008, the establishment of the state of Palestine is long overdue. The Palestinian people deserve it. It will enhance the stability of the region, and it will contribute to the security of the people of Israel. And it was at that point when I heard that last sentence, I went, really? Wait a minute. Hold on just a second. And indeed, if you go back, if you remember when Connie Rice was being hauled through the confirmation hearings back in 2005, one of the things that she said jumped out at me again. She said, I look forward to personally working with Palestinian and Israeli leaders and bringing American diplomacy to bear on this difficult but crucial issue. And then she continued, the establishment of a Palestinian democracy will help to bring an end to the conflict in the Holy Land. And at that point I went, right. And so if I had been at the confirmation hearings, I would have asked her one question. How well do you or any of the American leaders know the conflicting history of this region? And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book in the first place, was for the State Department people being posted overseas so they would know a little bit of the landmines that they were walking into there. Because in the past 4,000 years, Jerusalem, which supposedly the translation is the city of peace, it doesn't actually mean that, but that's what many people refer to it as. It's had 118 separate conflicts. It's the most fought over city in the history of the world. It's been completely destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, attacked an additional 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, been the scene of 20 revolts and innumerable riots, has had 5 separate periods of terrorist attacks just in the last century, and it's only changed hands peacefully twice in the last 4,000 years. This is a city of peace. I'd hate to say one that wasn't. Right, so this has been an extremely conflicted region, an extremely conflicted area for the last 4,000 years. Now, it started already back in 1350 BC. This is the Amarna letters in the 14th century BC, the Late Bronze Age, which is what I talked about in 1177 BC. But here, one of these Amarna letters is written by the king or the governor or the mayor, whatever you want to call him, of Jerusalem in about 1350 BC. And he's writing to the king of Egypt, and he says, message of Abdi-Hebel, your servants, may the king give thought to his land. The land of the king is lost, all of it has attacked me. I am situated like a ship in the midst of the sea. Well, this is 3,500 years ago. Some things really haven't changed. And so already the guy is in trouble. So, what I thought, we had 2 choices. One, I can walk you through all 118 battles, which I certainly don't mind doing, but you might not have the time to do it. So then I thought, let's do a top 10 list. That made 11. Except I couldn't get 10, I got 11. So this is a top 11 list. So these are the battles that affected the world in some way, that had ripple effects. So we start with David and the Jebusites in about 1000 BC, then we go to Sennacherib and the Neo-Assyrians in 701, Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonians in 586, Maccabean Rebellion in 165, First and Second Jewish Revolts in 70 and 135, Islam arrives in 638, you get the Crusaders and Saladin 1099, 1187, the Ottomans come in 1516, Allenby comes in 1917, Arabs and Israelis go at it in 48 and 67, 73, and then you've got the Intifada and beyond starting from about 1987. So, excuse me. So what I propose to do is to walk through these and tell you a little bit about them, and in each case, related to how somebody in the modern world has used or abused them. And we'll see if we can make it all relevant. Okay, following me so far? So, one of the first questions I asked myself is, why are people fighting over Jerusalem so much? And there actually is no really good reason, not right at the front. It's not a strategic site. It's not on a trade route. It's not militarily advantageous. There's no really good farming land right around it. It's pretty much in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So why are they fighting over it again and again and again? And I think it boils down to the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is one of the most sacred areas in the world. It has been the site of continuous religious worship for 5,000 years, since the Canaanites had an early high place up there from 3000 BC on. And so I think this is it. And in fact, Marin Ben-Venista, he's a deputy mayor of Jerusalem, former, and he said the Temple Mount is a time bomb of apocalyptic dimensions. And people have said time and time again that World War III may well start in part because of the Temple Mount, which is possible. Gershom Gernberg, if you've read any of his books, at one point he said that the Temple Mount is the most contested piece of real estate on Earth. And I think he's actually right. I can't think of something else that's been more fought over. So, when you go to Jerusalem, frequently people are afflicted by what they call Jerusalem syndrome, where you end up thinking you're King David. And you wander around. Anybody seen the guy that he dresses? He's been at the wall for years now. He's dressed like King David. And so I think it's kind of like this. You've got kind of a Jerusalem syndrome, but in terms of war, in terms of politics. Remember, this city is sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Each of them wants a piece of it, and if one of them has it, the other two want it. It's very rare that you've got a period where all three are living in idyllic harmony. So on top of the Temple Mount, of course, we originally had, according to biblical tradition, Solomon's Temple, followed by Herod's Temple. The Dome of the Rock is there now, and so this shows how sacred it is to the various different religions. Inside the Dome of the Rock, I don't know how many of you, anybody been inside the Dome of the Rock? Right, okay, so a couple of you. This little area of pink is indentations in the rock, which take your choices either where the Ark of the Covenant was, or is the ladder that Muhammad ascended to heaven, or the hoofprints of Borak, his steed, when he went flying up there on his nocturnal journey. So that piece of rock is extremely relevant, and indeed it's supposed to be the rock, Mount Moriah, on which Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. So you've got something pretty much for everybody right up there on top of the Temple Mount. Now here's what Jerusalem looks like. It actually is extremely hard to conquer. If any of you were planning to go out and militarily capture Jerusalem any time in the future, you might want to take into consideration that we've got the Kidron Valley on one side. There was a valley in the middle, the Central Valley. It's now filled in. It's an east and a west ridge, so the Central Valley is filled in. It's kind of a dip in the middle of King George Street if you ever are walking around. But on the other side, then you've got the Hinnom Valley coming around on one side and down through the bottom. So Mother Nature has protected the site on three sides. And as you can see, the only place that you can attack it is from the north, the unprotected northern side. That's really the only way to do it, especially in antiquity when you're on foot and you've got your horses and all that. So they realized this in antiquity, of course, and by the time the Romans went to capture it, there were no fewer than 3 fortification walls, one inside another, that were trying to protect it from the north. Even that didn't work either. The most recent time anybody captured the city from the north was 1967 in the Six-Day War, when the Israeli paratroopers came in through there. So, let's start at the beginning then with David and the Jebusites. Here's the famous statue of David. This is what the city would have looked like at that time period. In fact, we're really only talking just about this bottom part, because up here with the Temple Mount, that's all built by Solomon right after David. So we're talking about this particular region, and we've got the biblical account here, in which it says the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. So the Jebusites are the people that owned Jerusalem at that time. They're Canaanites, cousins of the Canaanites. Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, they said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. David said on that day, "Whoever would smite the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft." And actually the Hebrew is sinor, to attack the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. So in terms of trying to reconstruct how David might have captured Jerusalem, which would have been tough to capture, people have focused in on this Hebrew word sinor. And in fact, part of the problem is this biblical account is the only source we've got. There's no corroborating account that's out there. So usually a sinor is translated, as I just did, a water shaft. And so you've got this is part of the water system in Jerusalem, and Herschel Shanks took a picture of some guy climbing up it, and this is supposed to be the water shaft that Joab, the right-hand man, would have climbed up a little after midnight when the guards are changing, and you get in, you kill everybody, open up the gates, and in comes the army. So that is a definite possibility, but that's not the only definition of a tzinor. It can be a water shaft. It can also be a grappling hook, and that makes sense to me. You would attack the city using a grappling hook. It also can mean a ladder, and it can also mean male genitalia. That one I've got a little question. I'm not sure how that would help you capture the city, but that was a joke, by the way. But it is, that is one of the translations. So I think water shaft is probably the best of all of those possibilities. But the problem is that this particular shaft, which was found and named by Charles Warren, British military guy, is not actually in operation as part of the water system until well after about 800 BC. So a good 200 years after David. There's no way they could have climbed up because it wasn't in operation. But about 10, 15 years ago, Ronnie Reich, who was the archaeologist for Jerusalem, doing a rescue mission for a museum they were building in this area, came upon some huge blocks of stone that are back in the Middle Bronze II period, about 18th century BC. These are Canaanite. You can see just how large they are. And they are guarding the Gihon spring. They're guarding the water source for Jerusalem. And so if you want then to talk about it, here's the new stuff he just found. There's Warren Shaft in green. But the new stuff that Ronnie just found actually works, because it was built 1800 BC, which is 800 years before David, but it's still in operation. So if you want him to climb up a tzinor and climb up the water shaft, like the spider going up the water spout, you could have him do it. So if you want your biblical account to be correct, you can use it that way. Apart from that, we don't have any other evidence of it having actually happened, except that we do know that David does take over, so it must have happened in some way. Now this is a battle that is still being fought today, 3,000 years later. Here you've got Yasser Arafat, now passed away, but he was very well known, especially in the late 80s and into the early 90s. He said things like, our forefathers, the Canaanites and Jebusites, built the cities and planted the land. They built the monumental city of Yerushalayim, namely Jerusalem. And Faisal Husseini, who was the Palestinian minister for Jerusalem until he died of a heart attack in Kuwait in 2001, he said, yes, I'm also a descendant of the Jebusites, the ones who came before King David. This Jerusalem was one of the most important Jebusite cities in the area, and yes, it's true, we are the descendants of the Jebusites. Now, if you look at what these guys were saying back in the late 80s, they were all saying that they were descendants of the Philistines and the Canaanites. Somebody must have then said to them, well, that's well and good, but it's the Jebusites in charge of Jerusalem. So in the early 90s, they changed it, and suddenly they were the descendants of the Jebusites. Right? In point of fact, their ancestors probably did not come in until after Islam had conquered the region in 7th century AD. So, but you've got both Israelis claiming they go back to the Israelites, and you've got Palestinians claiming they go back to the Canaanites. So both sides are fighting a war that is not going to be determined unless you do DNA analysis, and even then I'm not sure that you could actually figure it out. But the Israelis, not to be left out, decided to do something similar. So I don't know if some of you may remember back in about 1996, the Israelis started ramping up for a Jerusalem 3000 celebration, which was going to be celebrated in the year 2000, not Y2K, but it was celebrating 3,000 years since David had founded Jerusalem. Well, they put out all kinds of things, banners and jigsaw puzzles and even medallions, and you can get these on eBay, by the way. I've got a collection started. To this, the Palestinians said, what do you mean Jerusalem 3000? Jerusalem was founded in 3000 BC, and so it should be Jerusalem 5000. You're leaving out 2,000 years of Canaanite history, to which the Israelis shrugged and said, yes, so. And that was that. That was that. So my point is that the battle is still being fought. David and the Jebusites may have been 1000 BC, but the Israelis and the Palestinians are still both referring back to that battle, even today, 3,000 years later. All right, well, after he takes the city, however he may have taken it, David, of course, moves the Ark of the Covenant down to Jerusalem, and then Solomon builds the temple and puts it in the Holy of Holies. Right? Now, Things are calm for just a little bit, but not that long. Jerusalem is never calm for long. There's probably not 20 years that goes by before something else happens. So in fact, when Solomon dies in about 925, almost immediately, he dies about 930 BC, almost immediately we're told in the Bible that Shishak comes up from Egypt. And it says, after Rehoboam's position as king was established and become strong, yada yada yada, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and so and so and so. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. So the Bible says that as soon as Solomon died, that Shishak from Egypt comes on up and captures. And indeed, 2 Chronicles also says, when Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shields Solomon had made. Now, as a historian, I want 3 separate independent sources before I will believe anything. So here's one, biblical account saying Shishak came up. Do we have any other evidence? Well, yes. From Egypt, we have a guy with a very similar name. His name is Shoshank. He's the founder of the 22nd dynasty. He's actually Libyan. And he comes up and attacks the region of Israel and Judah. How do we know this? Well, he writes it on the walls of his temple down in Egypt. And he gives us the names of the cities, including Megiddo, which is one of the places where I excavate. And so if you plot it out, here we go. We've got a campaign of Shoshank in about 925. The questions are twofold, though. One, does Shoshank or Sheshonk say that he actually captured Jerusalem? And 2, is he biblical Shishak? And some people say they're not the same, just the names are very similar. I go with Occam's razor. You got a guy in the Bible called Shishak, you got a guy in Egypt at the same time called Shoshank. I'm pretty much sure it's the same guy. Right? But there are people that want to split them by even a couple of hundred years. The other problem, though, is in the Egyptian inscription, he does not mention Jerusalem at all. It's just not mentioned. So the Bible's got a number of cities listed, and Shoshank has a number of cities listed. They only have one city in common. But I actually think it links the 2 lists, because the Bible gives the names of all the ones in Judah in the south. His campaign gives all the ones up north in Israel, which I think resisted and therefore was worth it to write about. And that one city that's in common links the 2. So I would actually put the list from Egypt with the list in the Bible and get one big campaign. In which case, if he does attack Jerusalem, then one of the questions is he the guy that carried the ark off? Right? And I give this tongue-in-cheek. This was, of course, how many people saw the first Indiana Jones movie? Okay, if you haven't gone to see it, this is your homework tonight. Right. But this is called the Shishak hypothesis, that when Shishak attacked Jerusalem, just after the time of King Solomon, that he carried the ark off back to Tanis, which is, of course, where Indiana Jones went to go find it. I don't personally think this is what happened. I think the ark is destroyed accidentally in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which we'll get to. But this is where Spielberg and Lucas and all those guys got the idea that maybe the ark was in Tanis. But there is no other proof. I don't have a third independent source for Shishak or Sheshonk attacking Jerusalem. I would like to find some kind of burn layer in the archaeology, but we don't have that yet. So this isn't quite one of my definitive things. So the next one, though, actually kind of falls into the same category, but I kind of like it a little bit better. Sennacherib and the Neo-Assyrians in 701. Some of you are familiar with this guy already. On his prism, he says, in my 3rd campaign, I marched against Hatti, which is what he called Syro-Palestine. As for Hezekiah, the Judean, he was the king of Judah at that time, based in Jerusalem, who had not submitted to my yoke, I besieged 46 of his fortified cities and walled and surrounding small towns, which were without number. I took out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, etc., etc., etc. Himself, Hezekiah, I locked him up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. That's the most famous part of the quote, is like a bird in the cage. So Sennacherib says he attacked Jerusalem in 701. Here's the root of his campaign coming on down here. And we in fact know that he hit Lachish before he got to Jerusalem. And there the archaeologists have found evidence of the destruction of Lachish in 701, and Sennacherib back in his palace without a rival in Nineveh, which is in modern-day Iraq, he actually shows us pictures of him capturing Lachish. So when he says he went up against Jerusalem, I tend to believe him, even though I don't have the archaeological evidence from Jerusalem. I do have it from Lachish, the city before. So I'm going to agree with this. And 2 Kings says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah, and Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, right, so the city right before, I've done nothing wrong, withdraw from me, whatever you impose on me I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So in other words, he bribed him to go away, and that's why Jerusalem is not attacked in 701. So we've already got Sennacherib's prism saying that he attacked Hezekiah. We've got the biblical account here, and in fact the biblical account gives us these very nice specific details of the bribe, right, or tribute, whatever you want to call it. 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. And we have another inscription from Sennacherib that says, he, Hezekiah, was overwhelmed by the awesome splendor of my lordship. He sent me, after my departure, to Nineveh, his elite troops and best soldiers, and 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver. Now, if you compare this to the biblical account, 30 talents of gold is identical. 300 talents of silver, he claims 800 talents. But, you know, what's 500 talents of silver among friends? So, it's actually a couple of $1 million, but never mind. Right. So here again, I suspect that this actually did happen because we've got Hezekiah's, what we call extra-biblical inscriptions saying what happened, and then we've got the biblical account which confirm it, and then we've got the destruction at Lachish. So I'm going to say that Sennacherib probably did besiege Jerusalem and that he was bribed to go away. But there is one other alternate account. There is one account that says the Neo-Assyrian army was struck down in a single night. It's from Isaiah 37, if anybody's familiar with it. Let's see, I will defend the city to save it for my own sake, for the sake of my servant David. The angel of the Lord went forth and slew 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, there were all these dead bodies, and then they left. Now, I, probably like you, have trouble thinking that 185,000 people were killed in a single night. But it is not out of the question if you look at this as biological warfare. There was ergot back then. You could poison the wells if you wanted to, and it has been suggested that this was not so much a biblical miracle as the case of the first biological warfare, and that that's what the people in Jerusalem did, was poison the wells that the Neo-Assyrians were using, and after they all died, they said, this isn't worth it, and they retreated. So I put that out as a possibility also. I would suspect mostly that they were bribed to go away. But, okay, it didn't work the next time. Neo-Assyrians are supplanted by the Neo-Babylonians in the Middle East. Nebuchadnezzar in particular comes down, and you can see from Babylon, comes all the way up to Carchemish, and then comes down to Jerusalem. And he attacks the city a number of different times. And this time, Jerusalem does fall. This is the archaeological excavations after 1967 in the old city of Jerusalem. And you can see the black ash there. That is the burning from the destruction of the city in 586. And the reason we know this is not only the pottery and the radiocarbon dates, but there are also arrowheads in the destruction, some of bronze, some of iron, and there's a particular type of trilobate, a three-sided one, that is used only by the Neo-Babylonians. And so we know that this destruction is from 586. So this is probably the most famous one because, by the by, they burnt down Solomon's temple and it was destroyed at that time as well. Now, we know that Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem actually no fewer than 4 times. Most people just know the 586. But he attacked it 3 other times as well. And here, much to my relief, we've got information from 3 separate and independent sources, so I'm quite happy. We've got the Hebrew Bible talks about it. We've got the so-called Babylonian Chronicles, which were records kept by the Babylonian priests for each of the years. And then much later, we've got Josephus, the Jewish historian or Jewish general turned Roman historian. And then we actually have the fourth one, we've got the archaeology that I just showed you. So we're pretty confident that this actually happened. So we know that it came, first of all, in 598 and captured Jerusalem, which was led by a king called Jehoiakim at the time. And we're told he took away 3,000 people into the Babylonian exile at that time. Comes back and does it again about a year later in 597. This time, the king he had put on as a puppet on the throne had rebelled, Jehoiachin, very similar name. And this time Nebuchadnezzar takes away 10,000 citizens. So we're up to 13,000 people in the first 2 years already. Then there is a time where they fortify the city some more. We're told, let's see, Book of 2 Kings, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to the city. Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up, yada, yada, yada. So here's Jehoiachin leaving in 597. Babylonian Chronicle says pretty much the same thing. In the 7th year, the month of Kislev, the king encamped against the city of Judah. On the 2nd day of the month, Adar, it captured the city and seized its king. The king of his own choice, he then appointed in the city. All right. Then, the second puppet king, Zedekiah, also rebels, but he does it a bit later, 586. So we were 597, 596, and now we're down at 586. The first siege of the city back in 598 and 597 only took about 3 months. The siege in 586 took 18 months because the inhabitants had fortified the city a bit more. And this time too, Nebuchadnezzar wins and he takes away another 800 people. And we're told it happened on or around July 18th. The book of Kings just says on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city there was no food for the people of the land, and then a breach was made. So after 18 months of siege, the people inside are starving, and then the Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonians make a hole in one of those walls up in the north, and they come on through. And in fact, there's a passage from Lamentations that has frequently caught people's interest. It says, the hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They become their food in the destruction of the daughter of my people. So people have wondered if, during the 18-month siege, if the inhabitants of Jerusalem resorted to cannibalism and eating their own kids. Well, archaeology to the rescue. In the excavations of the old city after 67, they found no fewer than 3 toilets. I'll show you one of them here. And this particular toilet, well, you know, you got 2 holes in it. I won't go into details, but you can figure out what they're being used for. You've got a little bowl, which would have held lime, so you toss it in after you've done your business, much like we used to do with porta potties before they got all famous. And so what did the archaeologists do? Well, we excavate, right? This is what we were born to do. So you take the lid off and you excavate what's underneath, which I think we can euphemistically call night soil. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And then they looked at the night soil underneath microscopes, and they found some interesting things. First of all, from the undigested seeds and everything, they found out that the people that were using this toilet were not eating what you would have expected. They were not eating wheat or barley or rye, einkorn, anything like that. They're eating what I would call backyard plants. In other words, weeds. Right? I don't know if any of you did what I did as a young kid, but I used to go eat out in California something called sour grass, where you pull it up and the root was kind of sour and you chewed on it. We never knew if it was just sour because the dog had peed on it, but whatever. Anyway, they're eating stuff like that. They're eating dandelions and weeds, and it's the type of stuff that you would eat if you couldn't get out and actually do some farming. But more than that, when they looked at it under the microscope, they realized that whoever was using this toilet was suffering from both tapeworm and whipworm. We're seeing the actual images here from under the microscope. Now, any doctors, any pre-meds in the audience, what causes tapeworm and whipworm? Anybody up to date on how to catch these parasites? One is if you're not washing your hands properly, right? So it's not sanitary. If you do not cook the meat long enough, right? Either beef or pork, but probably beef because this is Jerusalem. And if you're not using enough water. So what kind of a condition do you have where people are not cooking the food long enough? It's not sanitary, they don't have enough water. Well, they concluded it is probably evidence of a siege. And I think they're probably right. So interesting what you can get out of the toilets. However, there was one thing they did not find in there, I'm happy to report. There were no human remains in this toilet. So if they were eating their kids, they were using other toilets. Not this one. Right. But I do think then we've got archaeology here corroborating the siege. Okay, and then it comes back a fourth time, because even then the puppet king rebels, comes back in 582, leads away another 745 people. So this is what becomes the Babylonian exile, when all the upper class and everybody are taken away. Jeremiah tells us that there were 4,600 people at one point. Book of Kings adds another 10,000. I actually think we've got 3,023 people, first of all, then 10,000, then 832, then 745. It keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going. And here in the end, what we've got is they said that they emptied out the land, that they had taken everybody away. In actual fact, it turns out that we've only got, let's see if I've got the numbers for you, if I added them all up, 14,600 is what the Bible claims. If you actually add up other things that Sennacherib claims, it's probably about 20,000 people that were taken away. But the population in Judah at that time is about 75,000. So there's not an empty land left. It's just they've taken off the upper levels, right? They took off the 1%, right? They took them off to Babylon. Now, any evidence of this? Actually, yes. In the excavations up in Iraq, they found one tablet. This is a ration list. This is saying who they're giving beer and bread to eat and drink. And one line says, rations for Jehoiachin, king of Judah. So we know that he made it to Mesopotamia. He made it to Nineveh or Babylon or wherever this was found. And then most recently, in fact the date on here is 2014, this book just came out. I haven't even seen it yet. Documents of Judean exiles and West Semites in Babylonia in the collection of David Sofer. All of these tablets came out on the art market, supposedly, the antiquities market, in the 70s and 80s. We don't know what city they're from, but it is referring to the city as Al-Yahud, the city basically of the Judeans. And so this is now going to be the newest evidence we've got for the exiles off in Babylonia, which is kind of cool. Right? I wish they had not been bought on the antiquities market. I wish they had been excavated by archaeologists, but you can't have everything. So this should make more news fairly soon, I think. Now, in terms, though, of linking it to the modern period, one of the guys who really liked Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Jerusalem was Saddam Hussein. In fact, Saddam Hussein, in his autobiographies, claimed that he was the successor to Nebuchadnezzar. He held, in the 80s and early 90s, he would hold a festival of the arts, including a laser light show at night, in which he would beam up into the night sky his profile alongside of Nebuchadnezzar's profile. He also had frescoes painted, right? He had paintings on the side of buildings. There is Saddam Hussein in his army outfit. There's the Scud missiles, but there also is Saddam Hussein dressed as Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, in order to have this painted, he had that chariot built. And I love the fact that the bow and arrow becomes the Scud missiles. Right? So he really put himself forward as the successor to Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, in what he bills as his autobiography, except that it was ghost-written, but never mind, he said back in about 1979, he said, Nebuchadnezzar stirs in me everything relating to pre-Islamic ancient history. What's most important to me about Nebuchadnezzar is the link between the Arabs' abilities and the liberation of Palestine. Nebuchadnezzar was, after all, an Arab from Iraq, albeit ancient Iraq. And never mind, he wasn't actually an Arab, but that's okay. He's mixing up his history a bit. But Nebuchadnezzar was the one who brought the bound Jewish slaves from Palestine. That's why whenever I remember Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm sure he dreamed of him every night, I like to remind the Arabs, Iraqis in particular, of their historical responsibilities. It's a burden that should not stop them from action, but rather spur them into action because of their history. So many have liberated Palestine throughout history before and after the advent of Islam. This caused a little consternation in a couple of agencies in Washington, D.C. when it came out. But what he did later caused even more consternation, so I will come back to that in a moment. But in the meantime, let me flip quickly through a couple of the other battles. We won't spend long on them, but the Maccabean Rebellion, sorry, fighting the cold here. The Maccabean Rebellion is the first of 3 rebellions that the locals did against overseers, oppressors. First was against the Greeks, and it was successful. Second 2 are against the Romans. They're not so successful. But in this first one, 167, they managed to throw the Greeks out, and they established their own state. It's their own kingdom. And they've been around for a while. This is where Hanukkah comes from, with the miracle of the oil in the temple and all of that. And this has, in particular, provided fodder for the early Zionists. You see here Theodor Herzl on the last page of his little pamphlet called The Jewish State, which came out in 1896. He said, "Therefore I believe a wondrous breed of Jews will spring up from the earth. The Maccabees will rise again." And he's referring to that Maccabean rebellion. So this, as the only successful rebellion, held great promise for the early Zionists. Some were a little bit more militaristic. This is Zeb Jabotinsky, who was in charge of the military wing of the Zionists. Said, yeah, they've arisen, the children of those whose ancestor was Judah, the line of the Maccabees. They've indeed arisen and washed away with their own blood the shame which previously stained and humbled dying Jews. So the Zionists made lots of use of the Maccabean rebellion when the Jews took over Jerusalem from the Greeks. Romans, as I said, not quite so successful. We got 2 rebellions. First and second one, 70 and 135, or 132 to 135. This is Herod's temple. This is what was in place. Remember, Solomon's temple had been burnt down in 586. Now, in 70 AD, it's going to be time to burn down Herod's temple. And these 2 destructions supposedly took place on the same day, which is why you get Tisha B'Av today, where everybody goes and mourns the destruction of both of the temples. But this is where the region becomes sacred to Christianity in addition to Judaism. This is where Jesus does a number of the notable events in his life, including kicking over here the tables of the money changers. So Jerusalem is going to become sacred to Christianity as well. And indeed, in Matthew, Jesus says, "You see all these," pointing to the blocks. "I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And this is usually looking forward as a prophecy to the destruction in 70 AD, which would have been 3 or 4 decades after this was made. The problem is, and the biblical scholars are arguing about when are these actually written, and some say Matthew was not written down until 80 or 90 or even later, in which case they're writing after the fall of Jerusalem. It's very easy to make a prophecy after it's happened. So, but I'll leave that to the biblical scholars to debate. And instead, turn to the actual developments. In the first Jewish rebellion, you've got Vespasian, and then his son Titus. They are leading the attack on Jerusalem. The rebellion started in 66 over a matter of somebody taking money out of the treasury, and by the time it's over in 70, the city has been absolutely destroyed by Titus, while Vespasian is now emperor back in Rome. Very famous painting by David Roberts. He had Josephus in one hand as he painted in the 1800s and came up with this great painting of Jerusalem. It really is a great painting. It's 12 feet by 7 feet, and it is missing. Anybody knows where it is? If anybody has it, let me know. I was able to trace it to Sotheby's in the 1960s, and then it disappeared. Rumor has it that an Italian art dealer bought it and cut it up into pieces for each of the little scenes. And so if we ever do find it, we might have to put it back together. But David Roberts also created a number of small little lithographs, 3 feet by 4 feet, and those went through about 3 different editions. And while I was researching this, actually a guy that I came across who was here in Texas had one, and he sent it to me. So I have now framed above my fireplace this lithographed 3 feet by 4 feet. And it is indeed quite the conversation piece. People walk in and the first thing they see is Jerusalem in flames above our fireplace. They're like, really? I'm like, well, it's logical to have it above the fireplace. Anyway, so if anybody knows what this painting is, let me know. All right, we also, though, we have coins. Year 2 of the revolt, which is dated to 68. A very rare year 5 of the revolt. Very rare because, of course, they get destroyed in 70, and so they're not making very many coins. And then remains of one victim. Just one body has been found. And not just the whole body, but just the arm and the hand. The forensic archaeologists say this belongs to a 20-year-old young lady. I didn't know that you could do that from an arm. I thought you had to have the pelvic bone and all that. They're like, no, wait and tell. So this is the right lower arm and the hand of a 20-year-old woman. I'd love to know what happened to the rest of her, because she was not found. This is in the burnt house in Jerusalem. I don't know if somebody hacked off her arm and the rest of her is elsewhere and this is what's here, or if it was disturbed later. We have no idea. But all we've got is this. In the next room, though, you can barely see it. There's the tip of a spear. The wooden shaft has burned away, but you've got the metal, the iron tip of the spear. So I don't know if she was trying to get to this or somebody else in the house, but that's all we've got, is that one partial skeleton and the spear. Vespasian did issue coins, Judea Capta, after this. Judea is personified by the weeping woman underneath the palm tree. And then he has a number of other things as well. But probably the most famous representation is on the Arch of Titus in Rome. How many people have seen this? Where they're carrying off the menorah and the other sacred implements from the temple as it's burning, or just before it's burned. And in fact, they do bring these to Rome. They're in the Areopagus for quite a while. And then they get taken off, and there's all kinds of questions about what actually happened here. But one of the most interesting suggestions that I've seen recently, and I'm not sure if I believe it or not, is the suggestion that the Roman Colosseum was built using the loot and the spoils and the booty and everything from capturing Jerusalem. Which is kind of an interesting idea, and I wouldn't know how you would prove it, except that Geza Alfoldi from Heidelberg, who is a master of what's called ghost inscriptions, has suggested that this may be what we've got. There's a fairly well-known inscription, which is put up right towards the end of Rome, if it goes down in the 5th century. 443, 444, this guy restored anew at his own expense the arena of the amphitheater together with the podium and the platform. And you can see his inscription carved into the marble block there. But Alfoldi noticed that in addition to the actual carving of the letters, there's also a number of holes. And he's like, why would you have all these holes there? And what he thinks is that there was an original inscription in bronze that had bronze letters with pegs, and that the holes are where the pegs went in to affix the letters to this. And so what he did, he recreated both. You can see in black the later inscription carved in, but in orange would have been the bronze letters that adhere to it. And so what he recreates is this. The original inscription would have said, the Emperor Caesar Vespasian Augustus ordered the new amphitheater be made from the proceeds from the sale of the booty. And the only thing that would have happened about that time, this is about 79, the only thing that had happened was, in 70, was the destruction of Jerusalem. So Alfoldi suggests that this original inscription shows that the destruction of Jerusalem helped pay for the Roman Colosseum, which is kind of a neat idea. But even this didn't explain these. You see right there where there's some red circles. There were still some holes that were not explained by this. And so what he said was, well, it was changed, and somebody added in a T just a little bit later, like a year or so later. Well, if you add in a T, what do you get? You get Titus. Titus Caesar Vespasian Augustus. So, for just the cost of a T, Titus said that he had built the Colosseum, and not his dad. But either way, both of them would have done it. If Alfoldi is correct. If he's not correct, none of this works. But if he is correct, then the Colosseum was built because they destroyed Jerusalem, which, as I said, is kind of interesting. Okay, they lose again in the second revolt. Bar Kokhba and the Lion, this is 132 to 135. There was a parchment that Yigayuddin found, which had the name of Shimeon Bar Kosovo, which is Bar Kokhba's real name. And they discovered this. He took it to the president of Israel. This is in the 50s. And he said, "Message from your predecessor, sire." And handed him this, which is, again, kind of fun. We have coins from this rebellion also. Year 3 coin. And again, the early Zionists were using Bar Kokhba. Here, Max Nordau says Bar Kokhba was a hero who refused to suffer any defeat. When victory was denied him, he knew how to die. Bar Kokhba was the last embodiment in world history of a battle-hardened and bellicose Judah. So even though they've lost, he's still using this today. And indeed, in 1969, bones were found. And the Israeli government declared that they were the bones of Bar Kokhba. Even though the bones were found with Roman military equipment and in the company of pig bones. So I rather doubt that this is actually Bar Kokhba. Nevertheless, I think it might have been Begin at the time, they declared a state funeral and buried Bar Kokhba with all full honors. So propaganda continues even today. Okay, Islam comes on in 638. One of the first things they do is build the Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount because it has been vacant since the second temple was destroyed. Herod's temple destroyed in 70. After 135, everybody's forbidden to go up there. This has become a garbage dump. And so when they come in, when the Muslims come in the 7th century, first thing that Caliph Umar does is clean off the Temple Mount and then builds the Dome of the Rock. And so the noble sanctuary, as it's called, Quran al-Sharif, looks very much like it does today. Right? So everything that you see there today is about 1,300, 1,400 years old. But the Dome of the Rock is supposed to be directly on top of where Solomon's temple and Herod's temple had been at one point. And this has led to some interesting declarations. This is at Camp David in 2000. Yasser Arafat said, the temple didn't exist in Jerusalem, it existed in Nablus. There's nothing there. There's no trace of the temple on the Temple Mount. This is true, there isn't any, but it's been built and rebuilt and rebuilt so much, so I don't know why you would find anything up there. He repeated it in France to Jacques Chirac in September 2000. The ruins of the temple don't exist. Our studies show that these are actually Greek and Roman ruins. I'd love to know what studies he's looking at showing that there are Greek and Roman ruins up there. But then in comes Benny Morris, enfant terrible of the new historians in Israel. But here he said, Arafat denies any Jewish temples ever stood there on the Temple Mount. It's a microcosm of the denial of the Jews' historical connection and claim to the land of Israel, Palestine. So again, you can see they're using and misusing ancient history for modern political purposes. And indeed, one of the most interesting things that I ran across, Moshe Gil, who studies early Islamic Jerusalem, he said the Arabic name, Bait al-Maqdis, was applied to the Temple Mount and to the city of Jerusalem as a whole, and frequently to all of Palestine. Now, what is Bait al-Maqdis? It means the Holy House. And Medinat Bait al-Maqdis is the city of the Holy House. In other words, Solomon's Temple. So the earliest names for Jerusalem when Islam came in the 7th century was the city of the Holy House. So for Arafat to deny the temple was there is directly contradicting his own history. But never mind, didn't matter. Okay, I will not go through these, we're running short on time here, but let's just say that during the Islamic period, Jerusalem bounces like a ping pong ball between...
That was time, was it not?
That was time. That's actually my alarm to let me know I'm within 10 minutes of finishing. So I'm within 10 minutes of finishing. Right. You've got the Islamic dynasties, in Damascus and Baghdad and Cairo and all that, and Jerusalem bounces between them. And we've got all kinds of battles here. But it ends up with, of course, the Crusaders coming in 1099. They had started marching back in 1096 or so. That's when the first call went out. And when they come in and they capture Jerusalem in 1099, it was bloody like you had never seen before. We've got any number of eyewitness accounts, including Fulcher of Chartres. He says, on top of Solomon's temple, which, by the way, he had misidentified, it's actually the other smaller mosque, not even the Dome of the Rock, to which they had climbed and flee. Many were shot to death with arrows and cast headlong from the roof. Within this temple, about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I tell? Not one of them was allowed to live. They did not spare the women and children. The Crusaders, in a 3-day orgy of war, killed everybody in the city. They killed not only the Muslims, they also killed the Jews, and they killed the Christians. When told they had killed Christians, they said, well, it's their own fault for dressing like the locals. They killed everybody. So, just this orgy of glory. And then the Crusaders take over, but they only hold it for 88 years. Because in 1187, Saladin comes in and takes it back. So, even though the Crusaders are up in Akko until 1291, they lose Jerusalem within 88 years. So, 1187. Balian of Ibelin surrenders. Some of you have probably seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven. It's actually a pretty decent movie. All right, Orlando Bloom, if you like him. And Saddam Hussein claims he's not only the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, but he's also the successor to Saladin. And in fact, in that autobiography, he calls himself the noble and heroic Arab fighter Saladin II Saddam Hussein. Yeah. He leaves out one thing. Saladin was Kurdish. Neglects to mention that anywhere. Right. So, the Ottomans come in 1516, Selim I. This is one of the only times when the city is transferred peacefully. Suleiman the Magnificent comes in, and he's the guy that builds the walls that you see around the old city today. All right, so these are all Ottoman from about the 17th century or so. Napoleon came through in 1798, and he's one of the few people not to fight a battle here. In fact, he said, let's see, do I have the quote? Yeah. Jerusalem is not in my line of operation. I do not wish to be annoyed by mountain people and difficult roads. So Napoleon didn't even bother with Jerusalem, right? And then Mark Twain actually visited the city in 1867, and he said, a fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in an hour. I do not know how else to make one understand how small it is. Jerusalem is mournful and dreary and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. So that's 1867 and our good friend Mark Twain. Well, Allenby captures the city in 1917, World War I. And rumor had it was that as he entered through the Jaffa Gate, he muttered to his men, now the Crusades have ended. To his dying day, he swore he never said that, and he wouldn't have said it. But that was the rumor all the way through. He even gave a speech in the YMCA, the IMCA in Jerusalem in 1933, in which he said, I did not say that. Still, you'll find it all over the internet. If you Google Allenby in Jerusalem, you'll find this absolutely everywhere. The most interesting story, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the most interesting story has to do with the surrender of the city. Because actually when Allenby came through, it was a couple days after the city had already been captured, and it was stage managed from London. The actual guys that captured the city was back on the 9th of December, and they are these two guys in the pith helmets. This guy with the cane, he's the mayor of Jerusalem, and he wandered out on this morning with the keys to the city, trying to surrender the city to somebody. He came upon two cooks first. They were searching for eggs for breakfast for the men. And they said, we're not worthy, you can't give us the keys to the city, but try those guys. And he passed them up to the next in command, and those two guys said, we're not worthy. He went, captain, lieutenant, sergeant, major, whatever the order is, and everybody kept saying, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. Until finally a general said, well, yes, I'm worthy, and he took the keys. And then later, 2 days later, handed them over to Allenby. Well, the irony of the story is that this mayor of Jerusalem died of pneumonia about 2 weeks later. And on his deathbed, he lamented that he was dying because he had had to give up the city too many times when he gave the keys to all those people. He's like, if the first guys had just taken the keys, I wouldn't be dying now. So, If somebody offers you the keys to the city, you take it. Later, you can give them to whoever needs it. Well, Winston Churchill showed up in 1921 and gave a speech over the British military cemetery in Jerusalem. I just wanted to show you this because he managed to compact thousands of years of history into almost a single sentence. Said these veteran soldiers lie where rests the dust of the caliphs, the crusaders, and the Maccabees. Their monuments will be maintained not only for centuries, but as long as the British state endures. Peace to their ashes, honor to their memory, and may we not fail to complete the work they began. So he got in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all in one sentence. Churchill was good. The only problem was, he said it will maintain as long as the British state endures. He says this in 21. It's only going to be around until 48 in this region, so only a couple more decades. But even here then, Menachem Begin in 48 refers back. Hebrew revolt of 44 to 48 has been blessed with success. First Hebrew revolt since the Hasmonean insurrection, so referring back to the Maccabees. On the other side, Secretary General of the Arab League said, this will be a war of extermination, it will be a momentous massacre to be spoken of like the Mongolian massacre and the Crusades. So even in 48, they're looking back. Ben-Gurion, after the war, looks back. He says the chain that was broken in the days of Shimon Bar Kokhba was reinforced in our day. So again, looking back, looking forward. And even in 67, the commander of the Israeli Air Force, I like this because he was leaving nothing to chance. The spirit of Israel's heroes accompanied us in the battle, from Joshua, King David, the Maccabees, and then the fighters of 48 and 56. We will draw strength. So he goes all the way back to Joshua and King David before flying off in 1967. Well, it continued up to the present to bring us right up to speed here. Again, at Camp David in 2000, Arafat said to Clinton, I can't betray my people. Do you want to come to my funeral? I'd rather die than agree to Israeli sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif and won't go down in Arab history as a traitor. So he's not going to give back the Temple Mount, which is in command of the Waqf these days. He said, as I told you, Jerusalem will be liberated, if not now, then later, in 5, 10, or 100 years. And that's where we started getting these marches with the suicide bombers, with the fake bombs there. Jerusalem's before our eyes, tomorrow it will be in our hands, and at the height of the Intifada, this is what you would see, especially on the newscast. Well, the other side said the exact same thing. Here's Barak in September 2000. No Israeli prime minister will ever confer exclusive sovereignty over the Temple Mount to the Palestinians. It's been the cradle and the heart of the identity of the Jewish people for 3,000 years. And that's it in a nutshell. The problem is you've got two groups both claiming the same land, both of which have been there for quite a while, neither of which wants to give it to the other side. Well, in came Saddam Hussein in 2003. He said he was going to solve the whole thing, and he created what he called the Jerusalem Army. And he said within a couple months he had 2 million people in the Jerusalem Army, and we had pictures like this on the nightly newscast with them chanting, here we come Saddam, here we come Jerusalem. Normally you wouldn't take something like this, that seriously, except A, it was Saddam Hussein, and B, this is the guy that said he was the successor to Nebuchadnezzar and to Saladin, and they're the only 2 people from Iraq that have ever captured Jerusalem. So again, the agencies in D.C. sat up and took notice when he made this claim. It never came to fruition, of course, and now Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein are both dead and buried. But I'm still wondering, if we look at Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright, I think we can use a sentence of his and apply it to Jerusalem, that there, more than anywhere else, there is no present or future. There's just the past happening over and over again. History does repeat itself, but it seems to repeat itself more often in Jerusalem than anywhere else. So I would end by saying that Jerusalem is still besieged on all sides. There's certainly no real peace there. So I'm wondering how much longer it can be until we can quote Isaiah and say, speak tenderly to Jerusalem, cry to her that her warfare is ended. I'm hopeful it will happen soon, but I'm not optimistic, not on the basis of the last 4,000 years of history. So if I were able to talk to Condi Rice, I would have told her all this, and I would have said, be very, very careful what you're doing, and you never know what's going to happen. So is there going to be peace there? can only wait and see. And the one thing that I would say is from 1948, add 88 years, and you've got the limit that the Crusaders were there, or 67 or whatever, but 88 years is not that far away, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody got the idea of trying to do a new Saladin. So I'm not going to make any predictions here, but do the math and figure out when we might get the next conflict that could happen. All right, ending on that downer note, thank you.